Because I review flagship TVs and monitors every year, it is easy to lose sight of just how much progress has been made, since the improvements from one generation to the next can often seem quite incremental. So today, we're doing something a little different. On your right is the original Alienware AW3426DW, which kickstarted the OLED gaming monitor revolution when it first launched in 2022. On your left is the latest iteration 4 years later, the new Alienware AW3426DW. Having compared them side by side, I can tell you that the upgrade is substantial, putting into perspective just how far Alienware's high-end OLED gaming monitor has evolved over the past 4 years. The most obvious improvement is text clarity. Every previous QD-OLED panel until now, whether used in a TV or monitor, has employed a triangular subpixel layout which can introduce color fringing around fine text and high contrast edges. The new AW3426DW adopts Samsung Display's latest 5th generation pentatandem QD-OLED panel with a redesigned RGB-stripe subpixel structure, delivering noticeably cleaner text, sharper interface elements and reduced color fringing, making it a better monitor not just for gaming but also everyday desktop productivity. The new panel has also received a revised anti-glare coating which looks more neutral under ambient lighting, avoiding the magenta tint seen on earlier QD-OLED generations while preserving deeper blacks to improve ambient contrast, although WOLED panels equipped with a front polarizer still retain an advantage in this regard. Brightness has improved too. The Alienware AW3426DW carries a DisplayHDR True Black 500 certification, offering both higher HDR peak brightness and perhaps more importantly, higher full-screen luminance, helping address one of the biggest complaints about earlier OLED monitors when reading documents with predominantly white backgrounds, especially in a brightly lit room. I will show you the exact measurements from our review sample later in this video. The AW3426DW has also benefited from improvements in panel durability. Previous generations of QD-OLED monitors occasionally arrived with micro scratches caused by contact with the protective packaging during shipping. Samsung Display, the vendor, has increased the panel hardness from 2H to 3H, and I'm pleased to report that our review sample arrived in pristine condition without micro scratches after removing the protective film. Finally, the refresh rate has increased to 280Hz. While that's still short of the 360Hz offered by some more expensive monitors using the same 5th generation ultra-wide QD-OLED panel, it's nevertheless another welcome step forward. Now, beyond the hardware improvements we've already discussed, let's see how the Alienware AW3426DW performs in our objective picture quality test, starting with color accuracy. For SDR, the most accurate picture preset is the Creator mode, but you will need to switch the color space from the default DCI-P tree, which uses a greener white point and wider color gamut, to sRGB, targeting the D65 white point and the sRGB/Rec709 color gamut used by the vast majority of SDR content. The good news is that our Alienware AW3426DW review sample arrived extremely well calibrated from factory. In sRGB mode, it delivered an average delta error below 1 across 140 patches measured using the demanding color checker SG chart, with no inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3. As a result, SDR content looked highly cinematic and natural, particularly if you changed the gamma setting from the default 2.2 to 2.4 to impart greater image depth when watching in a dimly lit room. One small point to note is that the default brightness setting of 75 in sRGB mode measured above 160 nits on our sample. If you're aiming for the reference 120 nits in a darker viewing environment, we would recommend reducing brightness to around the low 50s. Only the game and custom color picture modes allow for white balance and color management or CMS adjustments, but these remain locked to the monitor's native white color gamut, making them unsuitable for accurate SDR, sRGB or Rec709 reproduction. For HDR, DCI-P3 color gamut coverage measured 99.4% in UV terms, while Rec 2020 coverage reached 81.5%. The spectral power distribution exhibited beautifully distinct red, green and blue emission peaks characteristic of QD-OLED technology, enabling highly saturated colors within the panel's luminance capabilities. However, as with many QD-OLED displays we've tested, colors, particularly reds, could appear somewhat desaturated in very dark scenes. Moving on to HDR, the Alienware AW3426DW offers several picture presets under the Smart HDR submenu. Of these, Desktop and Game HDR tracked similarly to the DisplayHDR True Black mode, whereas Movie HDR overbrightened the PQD-OTF, making it less accurate and therefore less appealing to us. Our preferred Smart HDR setting is DisplayHDR True Black, and there are several reasons why. This is the mode through which the monitor achieves its DisplayHDR True Black 500 certification. On our review sample, we measured a peak brightness of 540 nits on a 10% window at D65 white point, alongside an impressive 330 nits full screen, preserving higher average picture level or APL in bright HDR sequences. Alternatively, there's an HDR peak 1300 mode which exceeded 1300 nits on a 3% window. However, as window size increases, the PQ-OTF begins to roll off below the ST2084 standard, causing high APL scenes to appear noticeably dimmer than in DisplayHDR True Black mode. This reflects a well-known trade-off with Samsung Display's QD-OLED monitor panels. DisplayHDR True Black prioritizes APL at the expense of clipping very bright highlights above roughly 500 nits, whereas HDR Peak 1300 resolves more highlight detail in small specular elements but produces a generally dimmer HDR10 presentation. Alienware attempts to bridge this gap with its HDR Peak 1300 Bright mode, which raises the PQ-OTF according to our measurements. While this partially restores brightness in high APL scenes, it also overbrightens HDR material below 200 nits, deviating from the creative intent. For this reason, and another I'll explain later when we discuss video processing, we preferred using the DisplayHDR True Black mode overall. The AW3426DW also adapts its HDR10 tone curve according to max MDL or maximum mastering display luminous metadata. Better still, when no ST2086 metadata is present, the monitor automatically hard clips at the panel's native peak brightness, effectively behaving like HGIG or source-based tone mapping. As such, we don't see much need to enable the separate source tone map option within the console mode submenu. The monitor supports player-led Dolby Vision, and we appreciate Alienware including an option to disable Dolby Vision entirely, avoiding unwanted UI switching and tone mapping inconsistencies for users who prefer HDR10. As expected from a QD-OLED display, the Alienware AW3426DW delivered class-leading screen uniformity. Full-field gray slides reveal no visible banding, dirty screen effect or color tinting, even when viewed off-axis, thanks to the panel's self-emissive top emission architecture. Dark uniformity was equally impressive, ranking among the cleanest OLED displays we have tested to date. Motion-wise, while the headline specification is the increase in refresh rate to 280Hz, the AW3426DW also handled low frame rate content extremely well. 24, 25, 50 and 60 frames per second video all played back smoothly, free from frame skipping or frame rate conversion judder, making the monitor equally at home displaying films and broadcast content as it is high refresh rate PC games. Moving on to video processing, native 10-bit gradation was generally excellent on the Alienware AW3426DW. Whether using this rotating quantization test pattern from the Spears & Mansell UHD HDR benchmark disc, the gray ramp from the DisplayHDR test app, or real-world HDR titles such as The Skies in The Martian, tonal transitions appeared smooth and largely free from visible banding. The main exception was near black, where gradation became somewhat coarser, potentially causing a slight rippling effect during fade to black or fade in from black sequences. The behavior was even more pronounced in the HDR Peak 1300 mode. As we switched between DisplayHDR True Black and HDR Peak 1300 on the DisplayHDR gray ramp pattern, the latter manifested noticeably poorer near black gradation, providing another reason why we ultimately preferred DisplayHDR True Black for HDR use. A quick word on the sharpness control. The default setting of 50 introduces a small amount of edge enhancement, as demonstrated by this Luma zone plate pattern. If you prefer neutral, unprocessed sharpness, we recommend reducing the control to 0. Let's turn our attention to gaming, which after all is what the Alienware AW3426DW was primarily designed for. Starting with responsiveness, input lag measured 15 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, 7 milliseconds at 120 fps, and 3 milliseconds at 240 fps using a Leo Bodnar tester. These figures are marginally higher than what we would expect, although the need to feed a 16:9 signal into an ultra-wide display may have skewed the results. To better reflect real-world PC gaming at the monitor's maximum refresh rate and native resolution, we also measured end-to-end system latency using NVIDIA's LDAT device, which takes into account the mouse click, CPU processing, operating system, game engine, GPU rendering, and finally the display itself. At 280 frames per second, end-to-end system latency averaged 11.6 milliseconds across 100 runs, delivering the highly responsive gaming experience you would expect from an OLED monitor. Combined with OLED's near-instantaneous pixel response time, matching a 280 FPS frame rate to the monitor's 280 Hz refresh rate also produced outstanding motion clarity, free from the black smearing artifacts associated with slower display technologies. In terms of connectivity, the Alienware AW3426DW provides two HDMI 2.1 ports with the full 48 gigabits per second of HDMI 2.1 and DSC bandwidth, as well as one DisplayPort 1.4, which would necessitate the use of DSC if you wish to play games at 3440x1440 at 280Hz in 10-bit HDR, though not in 8-bit SDR. There are also several USB sockets, including a USB Type-C port with 15-watt power delivery. By default, the monitor doesn't latch onto 4K 120Hz resolution from the Sony PS5 or Xbox Series X consoles. To unlock it, you need to enable console mode in the user menu, which modifies the monitor's EDIT accordingly. Naturally, because this is a curved ultra-wide display, you will still see black bars on either side of the image. One minor annoyance is that console mode remains enabled when switching from HDR back to SDR, causing SDR colors to remain unclamped and therefore oversaturated relative to sRGB/Rec 709 unless you manually disable the feature again. With Smart HDR set to our preferred DisplayHDR True Black mode for reasons explained earlier, and sharpness lowered to 0 to prevent edge enhancement from interfering with the test pattern, Max TML and Max FFTML clipped at 650 nits during the console HDR calibration procedure, allowing HIG-compatible titles to be displayed free from double tone mapping. VRR also worked well in minimizing tearing and frame drops, although VRR flicker remained visible in certain demanding scenes, particularly on static menus. One curious limitation is that while the AW3426DW reproduced full 444 chroma in SDR, HDR chroma resolution dropped to 422 across every refresh rate we tested. Alienware also includes an esports mode, allowing you to reduce the display image to the equivalent of a 25-inch 16:9 screen. Competitive players who prefer a smaller field of view may find this useful, since it allows more of the image to remain within the central vision, reducing eye movement during fast-paced gameplay. As with previous Alienware OLED monitors, pixel shifting is permanently enabled as part of the panel's burn-in mitigation strategy. This means you may occasionally notice one side of the bezel appearing wider than the other side, although the panel includes sufficient pixel over-provisioning to ensure that no part of the visible image is cropped. Last but not least, the Alienware AW3426DW is backed by a 3-year warranty that includes OLED burn-in cover, bringing it in line with the current industry standard for premium OLED gaming monitors. To sum up, having compared the Alienware AW3426DW directly against the original AW3423DW, it's clear just how far Alienware's high-end OLED gaming monitor has evolved over the past 4 years. The improvements aren't revolutionary in isolation, but taken together they amount to a genuinely substantial upgrade. The new 5th generation Penta-Tandem QD-OLED panel delivers sharper text through its RGB-stripe subpixel layout, higher full-screen brightness for desktop use and more impactful HDR, more neutral blacks under ambient lighting, and improved panel durability, while preserving all the core strengths that made QD-OLED such a compelling display technology in the first place: pixel-level light control free from blooming, vibrant colors, wide viewing angles, class-leading screen uniformity, and near-instantaneous pixel response time. Compared with other 34-inch curved ultra-wide monitors using the same 5th generation QD-OLED panel with an 1800R curvature, the AW3426DW does make a few compromises. Refresh rate tops out at 280Hz rather than 360Hz. DisplayPort remains 1.4 instead of 2.1, and there's no black frame insertion or integrated KVM switch. However, if those features are not priorities for you, Alienware's pricing makes a compelling case. At $800 or £709, it undercuts many of its direct competitors while delivering the same core panel technology and excellent overall user experience. For this reason, the Alienware AW3426DW earns our recommended Best Value Award. If you're after an even larger ultra-wide display with higher resolution, Alienware has also recently unveiled a 39-inch 5K 2K OLED model, and you can watch our coverage video by clicking here.